In the world of human psychology, there is a reality about the super empath that many people completely misunderstand. These individuals are capable of an unusually intense form of empathy. They don't simply recognize what another person is feeling. They can absorb and mirror those emotional states so deeply that another person's pain can register almost like an echo inside their own nervous system. And that extraordinary sensitivity often leads people to make a serious mistake. They assume that because a super empath chooses understanding over judgment, they must also be easy to deceive. They confuse compassion with ignorance. They mistake patience for weakness. But there is a point where emotional intelligence stops being about understanding someone else and becomes an act of fierce self-protection. There is one particular betrayal that can permanently change the way a super empath experiences a relationship. When that boundary is crossed, something shifts internally. The warmth does not gradually become weaker. It can disappear almost completely. The emotional door does not simply close halfway. For the super empath, it can feel as though the connection itself has ceased to exist. This is why people are often confused when someone who once cared deeply suddenly becomes completely detached. They may spend weeks or months replaying the final argument, searching for the exact moment everything changed. But the real turning point often happened much earlier, during a quiet internal realization that they may never have witnessed. If you have ever wondered how a deeply compassionate person can suddenly treat someone like a stranger, you need to understand what happens at the super empath's breaking point. Because once that internal switch has been activated, apologies, charm, promises, and even genuine regret may no longer restore the relationship to what it was. Empathy is often portrayed as softness, as the willingness to absorb another person's emotions and tolerate their imperfections. But genuine emotional intelligence is far more complex than that. Deep empathy can come with extraordinary perception. A super empath may recognize the pain underneath someone's anger. They can notice the insecurity hiding behind arrogance. They can understand the trauma influencing destructive behavior. They see the emotional structure beneath what other people simply perceive as bad behavior. And that is precisely where the misunderstanding begins. Because super empaths are capable of extending enormous amounts of emotional grace, unhealthy or manipulative people can start believing that this patience has no limit. They see repeated forgiveness and assume they have discovered someone without boundaries. That assumption can be dangerously wrong. To understand why, we first have to understand how the super empath tends to approach relationships. Most people use empathy selectively. A super empath may experience it much more intensely, responding not only intellectually to another person's distress, but emotionally and physically as well. So when conflict appears in a friendship, romantic relationship, or professional connection, the super empath often searches for the explanation behind the behavior. Maybe they are under pressure. Maybe their past has affected them. Maybe they are projecting an old wound. Maybe they simply need time to heal. This is emotional accommodation. The super empath gives people room because they can see the wounded person underneath the defensive exterior. But that generosity can create a dangerous illusion. A manipulative person may look at all those second chances and think, I can keep getting away with this. They have misunderstood what is actually happening. The super empath is not forgiving because they cannot see the behavior. They are forgiving because they are deliberately giving the relationship every reasonable opportunity to repair itself. But there is a mistake that can permanently destroy that willingness. It is not necessarily anger. It is not one careless, selfish act. And it does not have to be a dramatic betrayal. The real breaking point is calculated emotional manipulation after the problem has already been clearly communicated. When a super empath recognizes that a boundary is being violated, they will often explain it directly. They may tell the other person exactly what behavior is hurting them, how it affects them, and what needs to change. They are essentially handing the other person the blueprint to their emotional world. And this is where the unforgivable mistake occurs. Instead of respecting that vulnerability, the manipulator uses the information against them. They take the very sensitivity that was honestly revealed and turn it into a weapon. They continue the harmful behavior while telling the super empath that they are too sensitive, that they are imagining things, or that they are overreacting. That is the moment everything changes. Because now the super empath understands that the pain is not simply an accident. It is not merely the result of someone else's unresolved trauma. The other person has been informed, understands the consequences, and has still chosen to exploit the very qualities that made the relationship possible. That realization can trigger a profound form of emotional detachment. Instead of exploding, the super empath may become remarkably calm. Rather than screaming, seeking revenge, or demanding one final explanation, they begin withdrawing their emotional investment. The internal calculation becomes simple. Continuing to pour emotional energy into this relationship is no longer an act of love. It has become a threat to their own psychological well-being. This is sometimes described as an empath nova, a point where the emotional connection seems to collapse almost instantaneously. The warmth disappears. The access disappears. The desire to explain disappears. And eventually, the person who once seemed deeply invested can become almost completely indifferent. They may not announce their departure with a dramatic speech. They may not fight for the final word. They simply stop participating emotionally. If circumstances require them to remain in contact, they may become distant, neutral, and extremely difficult to provoke. Their responses become brief. Their emotional availability disappears. They may use a low engagement approach, often associated with the gray rock method, offering nothing that can be used to restart the old cycle of manipulation. It can feel confusing to the person on the other side. How can someone who cared this much suddenly care so little? The answer is that they may not have stopped caring overnight. They may have spent a long time caring, understanding, explaining, forgiving, and giving opportunities for change. What finally disappeared was not their capacity for empathy. It was their willingness to keep sacrificing themselves for someone who deliberately abused that empathy. And that is the deeper lesson behind the super empath. Empathy without boundaries is not healthy love. Eventually, it becomes self-abandonment. A deeply empathetic person may forgive countless mistakes that come from fear, immaturity, pain, or ordinary human weakness. But there is a profound difference between making a mistake and knowingly exploiting someone's kindness after they have clearly told you that you are hurting them. A super empath can understand your wounds without allowing those wounds to become an excuse for destroying theirs. Their sensitivity is not a weakness. Their patience is not permission. And their willingness to understand you should never be interpreted as an inability to see what you are doing. So remember this. Value the people who make an effort to understand what you cannot easily explain. Appreciate those who offer grace, even when they have every reason to judge you. But never confuse their compassion with blindness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already seen everything. And when that person finally walks away, the silence may not be punishment. It may simply be the sound of a boundary that will never be crossed again. The most dangerous mistake you can make with a deeply empathetic person is pushing them to discover just how completely they can live without you. Human beings are naturally designed for connection. Our brains contain complex systems that help us recognize and respond to the emotional states of people around us. One concept often discussed in this context is the mirror neuron system, the neurological framework associated with recognizing and internally modeling another person's emotional experience. For most people, this emotional mirroring varies depending on circumstances, but the person often described as a super empath experiences this sensitivity at a much more intense level. They are not simply aware of the mood in a room. They can pick up on subtle facial expressions, changes in someone's voice, body language, hesitation, and emotional tension that others completely overlook. For a long time, extreme sensitivity was treated as a weakness. The assumption was simple: if you feel everything so deeply, you must also be poorly equipped to handle conflict. But that interpretation misses something important. The defining strength of a super empath is not simply how intensely they experience emotion. It is their ability to combine deep emotional sensitivity with intellectual awareness and strong personal boundaries. Affective empathy allows them to feel what another person is experiencing. Cognitive empathy allows them to understand why that person may be experiencing it in the first place. That distinction is incredibly important. They can feel your anger without becoming your anger. They can recognize your pain without taking responsibility for healing it. They can understand your trauma without allowing your trauma to become an excuse for mistreating them. When emotional intelligence matures, empathy stops functioning like an emotional sponge that absorbs everything around it. Instead, it becomes more like an advanced internal radar. It detects what is happening, analyzes it, and determines whether that emotional information deserves access to the person's inner world. A super empath eventually understands a fundamental truth. Having an open heart without a protective boundary does not make you stronger. It leaves you exposed. That is why the super empath exists within an unusual paradox. They can be extraordinarily compassionate while simultaneously becoming extremely protective of their psychological peace. They may give people enormous amounts of grace. They can look beyond someone's anger and recognize the fear underneath it. They can see insecurity beneath arrogance. They can recognize the pain driving selfish behavior. But understanding someone does not mean surrendering your boundaries to them. A healthy super empath knows that their emotional energy is limited. It is valuable and it must be managed carefully. When they are functioning at their strongest, they do not allow another person's negativity to consume them. They observe it, they understand it, they evaluate it. This creates a rare combination. Someone who can make you feel deeply understood while also possessing the ability to protect themselves from emotional exploitation. That is why mistaking their patience for weakness is such a serious error. The same emotional complexity that allows them to connect with people so deeply can also give them an unusually clear perspective when they begin evaluating whether a relationship is healthy. And this brings us to the exact behavior capable of destroying that connection. Not every mistake represents betrayal. Relationships naturally contain conflict. People lose their tempers. They become selfish under pressure. They make thoughtless decisions. They sometimes behave badly because they are stressed, frightened, immature, or carrying unresolved wounds. A highly empathetic person can often see those factors clearly. They may think this person is reacting from fear, or they are carrying something from their past, or even they are having a terrible day. Because they can identify the source behind the behavior, they often give people more chances than others would. But there is a point where that generosity becomes impossible to continue. The mistake a super empath is least likely to forgive is not an accidental emotional failure. It is the deliberate weaponization of their empathy after they have clearly communicated a boundary. That distinction changes everything. When a boundary is crossed in a healthy relationship, communication should create an opportunity for correction. The super empath is often willing to have that conversation. In fact, they may be unusually direct about it. They will explain what hurts. They will explain what drains them. They will tell you what behavior needs to stop. They may reveal vulnerabilities they normally keep private because they genuinely want the relationship to improve. In doing so, they are giving you a map of their emotional boundaries. They are essentially saying, "This is where I am being hurt. Please understand it so we can protect what exists between us." But a manipulative person can take that same information and turn it into ammunition. Instead of changing their behavior, they study the vulnerability and use it more strategically. They may deliberately provoke the very reaction they know will hurt you, then accuse you of being overly sensitive. They may continue behavior you already explained was painful while insisting that you are imagining the problem. They may rewrite events, deny what happened, or make you question your own perception. This is where the relationship reaches a completely different level of dysfunction, because now the harm is no longer simply the result of ignorance, immaturity, or unresolved trauma. The person has been told, they understand, and they choose to continue. That is the moment the super empath realizes something critical. This person is not merely struggling with emotional regulation. They are consciously taking advantage of the empath's willingness to understand. The kindness itself has become part of the manipulation. And once that realization takes hold, the internal structure of the relationship can change permanently. For someone who places tremendous value on genuine human connection, discovering that another person has treated that connection with deliberate manipulation is an especially profound betrayal. The trust does not merely become damaged. The entire interpretation of the relationship changes. The super empath may suddenly see past the charm, the excuses, the promises, and even the apologies. They begin looking at the pattern rather than isolated incidents. And once the pattern becomes undeniable, superficial apologies may no longer carry any emotional weight. Neither does love bombing. Neither does sudden affection. Neither does another promise that things will be different. Because the issue is no longer whether the other person knows how to behave better. The issue is whether they ever intended to. This is where the super empath's response can look completely different from the usual cycle of betrayal and reconciliation. For many people, serious emotional betrayal creates chaos. There may be arguments, tears, repeated explanations, demands for answers, desperate attempts to repair the relationship, or cycles of pursuing and withdrawing. And that emotional intensity can keep both people trapped in the dynamic. A manipulative person may even depend on that reaction. As long as you are furious, devastated, explaining yourself, or trying desperately to fix the relationship, you are still emotionally connected to them. The super empath eventually recognizes this. Instead of continuing the emotional battle, they may choose something far more decisive: complete emotional disengagement. This is sometimes described as an empath nova. It is not necessarily rage, it is not revenge, and it is not an attempt to manipulate the other person into finally changing. It is a controlled, internal shutdown. The super empath reassesses the relationship without the emotional illusions that once protected it. They examine the pattern, measure the cost, and recognize that continuing to invest their emotional resources is damaging their own psychological well-being. Then they make a decision. The supply of emotional energy ends, the access ends, the investment ends, and the relationship that once consumed so much of their emotional world can suddenly become something they no longer feel compelled to save. That is the paradox of deep empathy. The same person who once gave you every opportunity to be understood may eventually become the person who understands with absolute clarity that they no longer need you in their life. When this transformation happens, you usually won't see a dramatic explosion. There may be no shouting, no final confrontation, and no emotional scene. Instead, what appears is something far more unsettling: silence. The warmth that once surrounded the super empath does not simply become weaker. It can disappear altogether, almost as though that emotional connection had never existed. They do not feel the need to deliver one final speech explaining every reason they are leaving. They do not threaten to walk away. They do not announce another round of warnings or negotiate one more chance. They have already reached their conclusion. And once that happens, arguing becomes pointless, because arguing would mean the relationship is still open for negotiation. In their mind, it is not. If they can completely remove themselves from the person's life, they may do exactly that. No dramatic announcement, no elaborate farewell, just absence. But sometimes circumstances make complete separation impossible. Perhaps they work together, share responsibilities, live in the same environment, or have unavoidable social connections. In those situations, the super empath may shift into a low engagement approach, commonly known as the gray rock method. The emotional personality that once made the relationship feel alive suddenly disappears from the interaction. Conversations become strictly practical. Responses become brief and neutral. There is no unnecessary personal information, no emotional disclosure, and no attempt to match the other person's mood.